Okay, Talion thought to himself, as he stared out at the field, the rabbit still hopping around. Concentrate. A need for strength, for power. More than I have. I need more strength. I need more strength. He kept on thinking to himself, over and over again, as he tried to concentrate the demonic energy, focusing it to his head and stomach. And finally, he opened his mouth, and as he did, a whirlwind torrent of air flooded in the direction of his mouth. A funnel of air so intense that it actually made his clothes ripple, rustling in the breeze that seemed to be created by him, like a small vortex all funneling down. Talion, of course, tried aiming in the rabbit's direction. However, the rabbit seemed unaffected in the distance where it was. The cycle of wind was strong, very much so. Many times over what it was before, but it didn't seem to be pulling the rabbit in. Talion was able to hold it for a few seconds before finally the flow of air slowed and his mouth closed, and Talion found himself trying to fight for breath, gasping for just a moment, as if he was holding his breath the entire time. He panted. Okay, well, it looks like we're making progress, but it's still not enough to eat the bunny. So, maybe I have to be closer, he thought, as he stared out at the field, seeing the bunny bounce around. He was more than 100 foot away from it. Perhaps if he got closer, the technique would work. So, not wanting to waste any time, and with no hesitation, Talion took off, running in the rabbit's direction. As he did, trying to concentrate, to create that same cycle of feelings and repeat the action. As he approached the rabbit, getting within about 30 feet of it as it pounced away, still trying very hard to keep its distance. Talion opened his mouth, and once more the gout of wind picked up. A small whirlwind of air, seeking to pull the rabbit back towards him. But still, the rabbit seemed to be unaffected. It slowed for a bit, having to take a bit more patience in its movements to not be swallowed up. However, so long as it stayed fairly close to the ground, even the heavy wind that Talion was creating didn't seem to blow the bunny away or sweep it up to be absorbed by him. The wind simply wasn't strong enough, or perhaps Talion wasn't close enough, he thought to himself as he continued chasing it around. Talion spent the next 15 to 20 minutes chasing that rabbit, trying as hard as he could to absorb it with his new demonic ability that he still hadn't decided a name for. But regardless of how hard he tried, the bunny seemed to continuously elude him. Finally, Talion stopped running, being fairly out of breath and with a fair amount of sweat building up on his forehead. He stopped for a moment to catch his breath, panting heavily. What is the problem? Talion said, as he knelt down, hands on his knees facing the ground, trying his best to slow his breathing, his heart beating quite rapidly. Why can't I eat the bunny? I mean, am I doing it wrong? No, the wind is strong. It should be working, right? If the ability is to absorb demonic energy, and the bunny is demonic energy, then it should be working. It should be pulling him in. So why isn't it? Talion thought, as he looked down at his hands and feet, clutching onto them as he tried to catch his breath. And as he did, he noticed that the demonic energy that he had gathered had dwindled down a lot. Most of the silvery aura that had surrounded him had almost completely faded. It was true enough that Rico had taken a slight chunk out of it when she used her technique. But in all appearances, it seems like he's used a heavy amount of it, as it was almost gone. Am I really using up that much power? Wait a second, Taleon thought to himself. Demonic power. Maybe that's it, he said, looking at the slight silver glow still emanating from his hands. Maybe I'm not using enough demonic energy. Teacher said that the more demonic energy you concentrate, the higher the result, the more it amplifies it. So, if I want to eat the bunny, I have to up the energy. Use more of my demonic energy when doing the absorption. That means I'm going to have to gather more, Taleon said to himself, scratching his head for a moment. Okay, let's get this over with. The sooner I get done with this, the sooner I can start learning magic, he said, as he closed his eyes and began trying to focus again. This time, trying to go back to the means by which he summoned his demonic energy in the first place, concentrating on that feeling of fear, needing to call out his power. And once again, there was an upsurge, a rush of power that came flooding out of Taleon. And as he opened his eyes, he saw that the silvery aura that seemed to cloak over his body had returned. It seemed to be about the same as it was when he first got it all the way out. In fact, it almost seemed a bit more, as if Taleon was getting better at it. Okay, that's better. Now, use more of it, he said, as he tried to look around, beginning to search for the rabbit in the distance. It didn't take him long to spot it, after which he began to give chase again, once again beginning the cycle of chasing the rabbit, trying to absorb it. This time around, the results seemed to be getting better. As Taleon used the technique, the amount of air that he was pulling in seemed to be far greater than it was before. So much so that on several occasions the rabbit almost seemed to nearly come off of the ground, only barely managing to stay put. And it seemed to slow its movement much more. But for all his effort, it still wasn't absorbing the rabbit. It continued to skitter away each and every time. And it wasn't long before Taleon had used up the energy that he had gathered once again. Now the rabbit had run off out of the clearing and actually entered the forest, making it even harder to track and making the wind less effective, as the rabbit could now hide behind trees and other things. This is taking too long, Taleon thought, shouting out into the woods. Come here, you stupid rabbit! Where are you? Why isn't this working? I mean, the wind is way stronger now. Why isn't it eating the bunny? Taleon said, as he once again started trying to catch his breath. And as he was seeing that the demonic energy that he had gathered had once again begun to dissipate down to nothing, he now had the task of summoning more. How many times was he going to be able to do this, he thought to himself. Surely his supply isn't infinite. If he keeps playing this game, he's eventually going to run out. He has to be able to catch the rabbit. But how? He thought to himself. It was at that point that his fire breath came back to his mind for some reason. This time, focusing on the fact that he learned to intensify the fire breath by holding the sensation. He wouldn't immediately release the fire once the sensation started. No, he would allow it to build for a few moments. The more he allowed it to build, the greater the fire breath would be. The hotter and more intense the flame, and the increase in size, obviously. Maybe this wind was something of the same. Taleon was just using the demonic energy in sort of a flow, a constant, steady stream of demonic energy. But what if that was the problem, he thought to himself. Maybe it's not about a constant flow. Maybe if I let it build, gather as much demonic energy as I possibly can, and then use it all at once, then I'll eat the bunny, he thought to himself as he closed his eyes and focused on gathering more demonic energy. This time, trying exceptionally hard to gather as much as he possibly could. Before, he was happy with the amount that he gathered, but he wanted to take no chances. If using more power meant that he was more likely to absorb the bunny, then he could use all the power he could get. So, he spent about 5 minutes gathering as much as he possibly could, focusing on the sensation of fear, wanting to survive, exceptionally hard, trying to recollect those memories, paint the picture in his mind as clearly and as visibly as he could. And surprisingly enough, he got the result he wanted. Before long, it seemed like he had collected a vast amount of demonic energy, more than 2 or 3 times what he had before. Yeah, that's better. Okay, focus, Taleon. Don't use it in a steady flow. Use as much of it as you can all at once. Let it build and then release, he said as he ran around the forest, beginning to look for the rabbit. After about 10 minutes, he eventually found it. It didn't take but a few moments for the rabbit to notice Taleon's presence. He wasn't exactly being stealthy, so the rabbit took off, back towards the direction of the clearing. And without any hesitation, Taleon followed suit, running as fast as he could through the woods after the rabbit. Unfortunately, it was running through a heavily brushed area, so it started becoming difficult for Taleon to get through. He eventually ended up having to jump into the trees and move through those, otherwise he'd lose the rabbit altogether. But he finally managed to catch back up with it as it made its way out into the clearing once again, running towards the center segment. With one last jump, containing all of the physical strength Taleon could muster, he jumped about 60 feet out, landing firmly in this clearing in the woods. He could see Rico and his teacher Salas standing on the far side of the clearing, and there was the rabbit running towards the center. It was nearly 50 feet away at this point. It's much farther than he'd like it, but now's as good a time as any to make sure this works. So, Taleon gave it everything he had. He allowed the demonic energy that he gathered to begin accumulating in his head and stomach, as much of it as he could force there, and as fast as he could force it, letting it stack more and more. So much so that he even started to see the silver aura that encompassed his body dissipating greatly. He was taking no chances of this being too weak, and so, at a dash pace, as he tried to keep up with the rabbit, Taleon finally began to focus on that sensation, the feeling of needing power, more strength, furrowing his brows and opening his eyes, casting an intense glare out at the rabbit's direction. Finally, he opened his mouth, his fangs on display, as an absolutely absurdly massive torrent of wind gushed out of nowhere. It made Taleon's previous attempts look like nothing, like a dull breeze. But this was more in the realms of a hurricane, a massive typhoon that was basically gobbling up, well, everything. more than 50 feet away at this point. The rabbit didn't stand a chance. In but a single moment, it was completely swept off its feet and rushed back towards Talion's direction, flying into his mouth as now a puffy cloud of white smoke. But that wasn't the only thing rushing in Talion's direction. Along with the fluffy white rabbit, he seemed to be absorbing basically everything. Stones from the ground, burnt pieces of lumber, water from the pools that had been gathering from the rain. Even chunks of the earth started to pull themselves up, rushing down Talion's throat and disappearing as if they were tiny, even though some were bigger than he was. Finally, the torrent of wind seemed to come to an end as Talion slammed his mouth shut. It appeared that, depending on the amount of energy he put into it, the typhoon couldn't be stopped once it was started. It would go until the energy he used to create it dissipated and absorb anything in its path. But that wasn't the part that was concerning Talion. It was more all of the rocks and debris that he sucked in along with the bunny, as he suddenly felt a very strong churning in his stomach. He felt like he was going to throw up. He covered his mouth, holding it tightly, trying to steady his stomach, but the more he tried to hold it back, the harder it seemed to build up. After a few moments, it seemed to be clear that there was no holding it back. So, with a look of utter panic on his face, Talion could think of only one thing to do. He opened his mouth and let it out. But what came out wasn't vomit. Instead, Talion found himself spewing a large stream of what seemed like molten rock. Stone and earth heated to the point that it was lava, and a fair amount of it at that. The sound of it scorching everything it touched as it hit the ground was, well, jaw-dropping. As the stream came to an end, stretching out nearly 30 feet, Talion once again found himself struggling to catch his breath, and hearing a sizzling from where he stood as he looked down to see drops of molten rock dripping from his mouth, scorching the ground as they made contact at his feet. The material did not have a satisfying taste to it. Talion, without any hesitation, began to spit the substance out, and just like the rest of the molten rock, it burnt to a crisp anything that it came in contact with. For a moment, he tried wiping the remainder of the lava off his mouth, and unfortunately found that he had burned his shirt, basically to ashes, at least the right sleeve of it. Seeing that it was still on fire, he did his best to quickly pat it out, as his teacher began rushing in his direction. "What in the hell was that? That is not what I told you to practice. Or was it what I told you to practice?" "Okay, teacher," Talion said, feeling very exhausted. "Mission accomplished. I ate the bunny," Talion said, as he fell backwards, laying on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. "Now teach me magic already," Talion shouted up into the air, arms and legs spread wide out in the clearing.